Imam Dr. Khalil Abdur-Rashid is the full-time University Muslim chaplain at Harvard University, instructor of Muslim studies at Harvard Divinity School, public policy lecturer at Harvard Kennedy School, and the chair of the board of religious, spiritual, and ethical life at Harvard. He was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. His late father was the first African-American mayor of the city of Stone Mountain, Georgia, the city that birthed the Ku Klux Klan. Dr. Khalil completed his doctorate in liberal studies in American Islam from Southern Methodist University and holds both a Master of Arts in Islamic Law and Middle East Studies, as well as a Master of Philosophy in Islamic Law and Middle East Studies from Columbia University in New York City. He earned his bachelor's degree in social work from Georgia State University and worked for the state of Georgia as a social worker for several years. He holds a master's degree in comparative Islamic law at Marmara University and completed 2 advanced Islamic seminary doctoral degrees in Islamic sciences. He has taught courses on Islam and Islamic law at NYU and Columbia University and taught Arabic language at Georgia State University. He was the first paid Muslim chaplain for Columbia University and Barnard College in New York City and served as an advisor to the NYPD police commissioner. He also formerly served as imam for several years in New York City and for several years as scholar in residence at a major Islamic center in North Dallas. Thank you so much for spending some time with us this morning, Khalil. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and good morning to everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, where we are going to be talking about strategic diversity leadership and how this skill and this technique or this set of skill sets can address racial challenges in our cities and by extension many of the other institutions located in our cities across the United States. And as a general theme to today's presentation, what we are looking at is changing hate into hope. So where are we today? And what's, we every day, we wake up and we look at the news and we see that because of the perfect storm factors that are contributing to the increasing recognition of racial disparities, racial injustice, that many are doing their part to address racial challenges, systemic racism, and the continuation of problematic racial tropes by acknowledging the problem and doing what they can to invest in diversity initiatives to tackle this. And just at today's scan of the paper, you see Netflix, for example, donating over $120 million to historical Black colleges, including Morehouse College and Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. PepsiCo retiring their Aunt Jemima brand and Quaker Oats. NASCAR has made an initiative to ban the Confederate flag, for example. The NFL is now talking about re-signing Colin Kaepernick and acknowledging the importance of protest. We had a few days ago, Harvard Business School dean in his letter which came out specifically addressing the low enrollment of Black representation in MBA programs at Harvard and across the nation. And one of the things he says is this also contributes to low Black representation in corporate leadership, which contributes to the disenfranchisement of Black leaders and Black businesses and Black communities as well. And he called for transformations in MBA and programs across the country. We had members of the U.S. military addressing the House Armed Services Committee yesterday, talking about racial disparities in the military judicial system, where there was an acknowledgement that of a long history of the persecution and the court-martialing of Black and brown members of the U.S. Armed Forces, and especially in the Air Force, at rates that far surpass the arrest and the court-martialing of U.S. military service members who are white. And you've got today House and Senate bills coming up, et cetera. So there are so many different initiatives that are happening now because of what I call this perfect storm of factors, where we've got an emergence of a national protest calling for systemic change and reform, in many cases calling for the abolition and the defunding of law enforcement and police across the city. We've got a global protest pertaining to anger towards racial disparities and racial injustice. You've got a change in demographics across America, and the change of demographics is both in the racial makeup of America, what's often been called the gradual browning of America, and you've also got a change in demographics regarding the thinking of America now. So the face and the mind of America is starting to change more and more, coupled with the fact that you've got persistent political, social, and economic inequalities that emerge from rising disparities amongst gender, race, socioeconomic status, which is brought to light through the pandemic, political discourse, economic disenfranchisement, mass incarceration, etc. Also intersecting with the business and the entertainment case for change in the sphere, which galvanizes the public, not only public wealth, but also public interest, and reflects public attitudes as well, where local businesses are really affected by the anger and the protest and the rage in our cities across our nation, intersecting as well with political and even in some cases legal threats to diversity and democracy. You see the gradual and increasing militarization of police, the persistent negative rhetoric around immigration, around Black and brown countries, persistence in hate crimes, and you've got a federal response that is muted at best. So these factors all coincide, and coalesce to demonstrate, to show that our communities and our cities are in a state where they need help. City government needs help in addressing systemic racism. Law enforcement, for example, cannot police themselves, although they've been left to that for quite a while. There is and has been the existence of around 150 citizen review boards in different cities different major cities across the nation, which are designed to sort of investigate certain aspects of police brutality and audit. But those citizen review boards are either defund or don't have adequate funding, don't have the adequate accountability and power that they need to do their job, and they're also reactive instead of proactive. You also have the fact that Black families, Black and brown families in this country and many communities across the U.S. experience consistent trauma due to police brutality, due to systemic racism. Harvard Kennedy School just came out with a publication and new research last week, which looked at the underachievement in Black and brown students in high school, where police shootings and police killings of Blacks have occurred within 1 block or 2 blocks of a school, and they've looked at the grades and the mental health of Black and brown students, and they've seen a consistent decline in school attendance and grades just from students that live in the neighborhood where shootings occur. So this affects families. It's a mental health problem. It's a pedagogical problem. It's a communal problem. And it's an entrepreneurial problem where local business owners and communities are negatively affected due to rioting and looting, violence, etc. So, what can we do? How do we positively impact change that is not reactive, but in the sense is proactive? And more importantly, how do we implement what's called transformational change and not just ad hoc change? And that's where the skill of strategic diversity leadership to address race comes into play. There are 4 dimensions of strategic diversity leadership that I want to highlight. And the first is organizational learning, where we change the behavior of an organization and its thinking. The second is structural leadership. The third is political leadership. The fourth is symbolic leadership. And the fifth is collegial leadership. I'm going to run through these pretty rapidly, but because this is a shorter version of a longer course that I do. So we're going to go, so the 5 dimensions or the 5 aspects of strategic diversity leadership in addressing racial challenges in our cities and in our institution. So the first is that we've got to reform our organizational learning and our thinking. And that's where, as a system, whether it's a municipal system, an institutional system, an organizational system, you want to break the flawed cycles of institutional thinking to create new thinking at the institutional level, at the city level. And there are 3 steps to doing that. The first step is, what are we doing? The second step is, why did it happen? And the third step is, what is our environmental context? However, in looking at these 3 steps, you want to start first with the environmental context. What happens is, oftentimes institutions start with number 1, what are we doing? And they respond tactically. What you want to do is look at, in reforming the organizational thinking, you want to look at the environmental context. What's the larger macro context that we're in now? And then from that, go to number 2. Why did this issue happen? And then from that, number 1, what are we going to do? Typically, organizations go linearly from 1 to 3. What happens is you want to reverse that and go from 3 to 1. Look at the larger environmental communal context, which will help situate the problem in its proper context and help provide an appropriate tactical response. The second is to reform structural leadership. And so this means that we've got to create leadership structures in our cities, in our communities, in our institutions, whether it's corporate or business or whatever, that help drive change that is transformational, not change that's ad hoc or separated or disconnected or temporary at best. And the techniques to accomplish that is that we've got to get senior leadership, top leadership, senior administrators on board to realign the organization, realign the mission, and to introduce accountability into the system and into policies as well. The third is to galvanize political leadership. And this is important because we've got to negotiate power dynamics and we've got to compete in setting priorities. Transformational change in our in institutions systemically has to be a priority of top leadership, and that has to do with negotiating power. There's an assumption that all politics are horrible, are bad, but in reality, politics is a natural consequence of the institutional life of every single organization, and it's not inherently bad. But we have to understand the city's institutions, the socio-political history related to inclusion and exclusion, related to racial disparities. We have to understand the history and how that history informs the structure of power and how that history informs the setting of priorities so that we can learn where tensions naturally arise and reside so that we can overcome those things. We've got to factor in the cost and the benefits to change. We've got to introduce and demonstrate that there is cost to change, but there's a benefit as well, and that transformational change is far more beneficial to the health of the institution, to the city, and the inhabitants thereof long term and even short term. Symbolic leadership is really important. The purpose of transforming symbolic leadership, and this is where we look at our symbols, where we look at our language, what kind of symbols does the city have in it? What are the names of streets? What are the monuments that are there? Meaning making. We have to transform meaning making and mobilize the proper kinds of meaning making so that we can introduce a new social contract in our cities that bind this new form of citizenry together. Again, the demographics of America is changing, and therefore the old forms of social contract are not sustainable for our immediate, let alone foreseeable, let alone unforeseeable future. And therefore, the meanings in our cities and in our institutions and the symbols that are there have to be looked at and re-examined. This is why you see the bringing down of statues across the board, because the meanings that are conveyed, the messages that are conveyed by the presence of certain things and by the absence of certain things, by the actions of institutions and by the inactions of certain institutions, inform how the cities, how our institutions relate to not mediocrity, but relate to excellence. And that's what this is about. Using strategic diversity leadership to address racial disparities in our cities and our institutions is about raising the bar from mediocrity at best to excellence, right? And so therefore, establishing a brand for racial excellence, and then excellence not just along racial lines, but since we're talking about race today, we're going to limit it to race, but you could apply that to gender, you could apply that to all kinds of aspects of diversity as well. Excellence has to be the standard, And this is what any institution has to stand for in terms of its culture, i.e. its practice, its symbols, its norms, its habits, and its policy, how it goes about doing things. And that's the difference between change and transformation. And finally, collegial leadership. What are the, with democratic institutions and institutions that thrive on public accountability, diversity leaders, and particularly leaders of strategic diversity leadership, have to possess the ability to build coalitions and integrate diverse views into the system and the structure of our cities and our municipal institutions, our local institutions, law enforcement institutions, because it creates, it develops creative connections between the institutional priorities, the city's priorities, and diversity-based goals and initiatives. It encourages engagement. It builds new key stakeholders in and around the city that have not been tapped into before, and it allows for a larger buy-in. So these 5 elements of aspects of strategic diversity leadership are the first pillars, if you will, to transforming and addressing racial problems. But it's not the only thing. What is needed in the midst of all this is a diversity plan to address systemic racism, and also what is needed is systemic accountability. These 2 things are key. A plan to address the systemic racism in our cities, in our institutions, in law enforcement, in the military, everywhere, and then accountability in the system itself. So how is that done strategically? Well, first of all, let's talk about plans. When you're setting up, or when you're thinking about establishing a diversity plan to address racial disparities and systemic racism, there are 3 approaches that are commonly used. One is an integrated approach, where the diversity plan to address systemic racism is infused into the strategic plans of the city or of the institution. And those strategic plans are part of the goals and the tactics of the organizational structure, and they are revised every few years. So it's integrated into the system, the operational system of the city, the operational system of the company, the operational system of the law enforcement, of the school system, whatever the institution is. Then there's the centralized approach, where it's presented as one area of strategic focus amongst others. So it's one area that has to be accomplished amongst other areas. And this obviously brings in or introduces audits as well. Some citizen review boards in many cities use this approach, but it's more, as I mentioned earlier, reactive, not proactive. And then finally is a decentralized approach, where the diversity plan to address systemic racism is part of individual units within a structure, not centralized within the core aspect of the plans and goals of the institution. It's not centralized and it's not integrated. But these are 3 approaches that are often used to do this. Accountability is key. If you want to address any kind of systemic problem, then accountability is the core driving factor that will govern and give you an indicator about the performance of the plan. It relates to excellence. It's a matter of excellence. The absence of accountability, simply put, leads to failure. You may have the best plan in the world, but if there's no accountability, no ownership, no consequences, no incentives, that plan is not going to work at all. And it provides a standard, and it's an indicator which measures the institution's progress and achievement over time. And so one of the major factors that we see now is that institutions, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's in school boards, whether it's in the city council, whether it's in corporate America, for example, there are no performance indicators over time that give an institution an idea as to how it's doing as it relates to its ability to develop relations with community members, to address racial disparities, systemic racism, et cetera, and so forth. And so oftentimes when you're dealing with an accountability, a scorecard is developed, where the scorecard communicates progress to top leadership, to different stakeholders in the community. The scorecard, grades the institution, and it serves as a means to deepen the institution's commitment to change. It helps provide clarity to the city, to the institution, and consensus about what the city, what the institutions are doing to achieve an elimination regarding systemic racism in its institutions, and barometers and standards for that. It assesses the effectiveness of existing strategies, and it helps set priorities going forward year after year after year. Now, this is really important because when we integrate accountability into the system, this is more than just window dressing. Oftentimes, what you find in many cities or institutions doing window dressing. So a simple law may be passed, or an initiative may be put forward, but it's not systemic, right? Or there may be an executive order that's passed, but it can be rescinded. And so there's nothing, there's oftentimes too much window dressing that goes on. But when you have real systemic accountability, then you'll include addressing racial challenges as part of performance reviews, for example, where stakeholders come together to share perspectives that can talk about engaging strategic communities and creating positive, important, diverse learning forums to educate leading members and top leaders about the problem of systemic racism so that they can urge their institutions to, and they can push for change. Benchmarking is really important. What are other cities doing? What are other institutions doing? Because in assessing the performance of an institution over time, being able to compare with other institutions that are trying to achieve excellence in their performance, that's oftentimes a catalyst and a driver for other institutions to rise to the level of higher performance. And therefore, systemic accountability and benchmarking is critical and very important as a part of the diversity plan to address systemic racism in our cities. Speaking of benchmarking, I have a few types of benchmarking. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but you can do competitive benchmarking where one city compares to another, one law enforcement office compares to another. Best-in-class benchmarking, historical benchmarking, where you compare the benchmarking of your city or your institution and its performance 10 years ago, 5 years ago, last year, for example. There's functional and collaborative benchmarking as well, where you partner up with institutions and establish a criteria for what you're benchmarking, how you're addressing systemic racism, and you allow a third party to grade and assess the performance of that. So there are various ways that you can achieve excellence and integrate a competitive aspect to addressing systemic racism and striving for excellence in the municipal institutions, corporate institutions, communal institutions, etc. So if this is possible, then why is it that diversity efforts fail? Why is it that so many efforts fail when addressing systemic racism? Well, there are a couple of questions that we have to ask that will really help highlight why there's failure. Number one, do we respond to a crisis or implement proactive strategies that can anticipate challenges and take advantage of opportunities? Are we just responding, or are we really looking at proactively dealing with problems, taking advantage of an opportunity so that things like this never happen again? Do we act in isolation, or do we build coalitions by leveraging different programs and resources? Are resources actually present to initiate change, or are they absent from the infrastructure to create change? So there's a policy brought forward, but then there's no funding behind that, for example. Oftentimes that's the case with the myriad of citizen review boards that we currently have. Is the intervention and the solution that's presented, is it ad hoc, is it here and there, or is it comprised of excellence and best practice efforts, systemic data-based efforts to counter systemic racism? And is it a marathon that we're running, or is it just a sprint? Are we putting forth short-term solutions to deal with the problem, or long-term? Are we thinking about 50, 100 years down the road about our grandchildren in our cities, in our institutions, etc.? When we think about law enforcement, when we think about schooling, when we think about the military justice system, the criminal justice system, all other aspects of institutional infrastructure in our cities. When we think about proposing solutions, are we thinking about today and tomorrow? Or are we thinking about 50 years, 75 years from now? So in thinking about these questions, there are a couple of impediments in the road to success, in the road to transformation, that are obstacles for change. And one is the absence of the onboarding of senior leadership. Now, we see in the current climate that we have increasing presence of the onboarding of senior leadership in cities. For example, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms in Atlanta is doing quite a bit to move Atlanta in a particular direction, even in the midst of the crisis that we're in now, for example. But in the absence of onboarding senior leaders, what happens is you have a failure to conceptualize systemic racial problems, as we've had in the Justice Department, where one of the heads of the Justice Department says that he does not believe that there is a systemic racial problem. So if the head of the Justice Department doesn't believe that, so then you have a problem with the Justice Department conceptualizing systemic racial problems. And you'll have a problem with the senior leadership being on board to deal with that. So those will be an impediment. You'll have a failure to create budgets and accountabilities if you don't have the onboarding of senior leadership and a proper conceptualization of the problem. And you'll have resistance to systemic change, which is fundamental to excellence. You've got to have systemic change if you want excellence. If you don't have systemic change, then you're not going to have excellence. So that's the key. The second impediment resulting from those questions is a lack of clarity on how the plan can be implemented. You might have the best plan in the world, but if there's a failure to create a comprehensive framework to outline steps, what's step one, step two, and to track progress, you won't have anything concrete. You won't have ownership over it. You'll just have a theory, right? You'll have an idea, and everybody else will have different ideas. You won't be on the same page. And three, the changing of an organizational culture, whether it's a city, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's whatever the system is not easy. And there's an inherent challenge that's there. So it's going to be very difficult. And because of the difficulty inherent therein, this leads some folks to just insert minor adjustments, what we call window dressing. There's a fallback to window dressing or symbolic changes that are not really systemic changes. And so because of the difficulty of the task or the long-term challenges that are there, in some cases, some cities, some stakeholders just give in to symbolic changes. And if that's the case, then we're going to have the same problem over and over and over again, and you're not going to get transformation. You're not going to address systemic racism. So when you're pursuing institutional change in addressing racial challenges, whatever the institution is, you got two goals. You have two goals that you need to put forth in the plan, in the diversity plan. The first goal is depth. It's got to be deep, which means the tactics and the means you use to reach your goal and the scope, they have to be deep. And we'll talk about that. And pervasive, which means it's got to reach all of the actors, all of the members of your team, all the members of your institution. Right? So if you have a depth that is shallow and narrow pervasiveness, then you have just minor adjustments, right? So this means, going back to the previous slide, depth is the means that you use, the solutions you put forth. Pervasiveness are the actors. So if you have just limited means, shallow depth means limited means, you don't do a lot of research, you don't do a lot of changes. And narrow pervasiveness, meaning you only implement those changes to a few members of the institution, everybody's not on board, then you'll get minor adjustments, i.e. no change, right? So you only do a few things, shallow depth, and it only reaches a few people, narrow pervasiveness, so you'll have minor adjustments. If you only do a few things, number two, shallow depth, but then you've got broad pervasiveness, it reaches everybody in the institution, but it's only a change here and there, one or two changes, that's shallow depth. You got shallow depth, one or two changes, but those one or two changes reach out to everybody, the broad pervasiveness. Then you've got far-reaching change. So it reaches everybody. The pervasiveness of the change is broad, is far, but it's not transformational. It's just change. One or two things change, right? Then you can have great depth. You do a lot of things to change the organization, a lot of different challenges, a lot of different new initiatives, but narrow pervasiveness, it only applies to a few people. So what happens is you've got change, but it's isolated. It's in one pocket because the pervasiveness is narrow. What you want in your cities and your institutions is not an isolated change, not a far-reaching change, but reaches everybody, but only one or two things happen. You don't want minor adjustments. You want what's called transformation. And transformation is when you got great depth, when you transform the system, you introduce a lot of different means and tactics to change the organization, and broad pervasiveness, which means it reaches everybody, the overwhelming majority of folks in the institution. That's when you've got transformation. If it reaches one department, you don't have transformation. You've got isolated change. If it reaches everybody, but it's only two or three things, you only have far-reaching change, but you don't have any transformation in the system. The system is changed when the system transforms how it does things, and everybody accepts those transformations. And that's what it takes to have institutional change. That's what it takes to have systemic change in the outcomes that are there. The key to this, when you have transformation, the municipal and institutional culture is altered through a change in the city is changed, the institution is changed via, number one, assumptions about people, about the people they interact with, the people they deal with, their assumptions about each other, the people in the society. It's a change in assumptions about people. It's a change in behaviors with people. It's a change in processes and interventions that support people. And it's a change in the outcomes of the institutions that elevate people. That's when you have an institutional change and transformation. But this comes from the diversity plan to address racism, that the assumptions about people are changed as a result of the interventions that are put forth, the depth and the pervasiveness, that it reaches everybody. The behaviors are changed, the processes, meaning the end result, the services that are offered, the way those services that are offered. So if it's law enforcement, the way that they interact. If it's city officials, the way that they interact. If it's school officials, the way they interact, right? The processes that support people and don't, convict people. They support and uplift and elevate people. So this is very, very critical to understanding transformation. So let's bring all of this together and what do we have? Because we talked about a lot of things. So let's bring this all together and narrow this down to the pieces that are integral and very important in addressing systemic racism as part of this diversity, the strategic diversity plan that you would put together to city officials or institutional leaders, etc. Number one, there's 7 parts. When you bring it together in terms of a diversity plan, what are you doing to address systemic racism? Well, there are 6 parts to this. Part A is the idea, the problem of systemic racism. Again, I mentioned if senior leadership doesn't understand it or doesn't accept the problem, it's going to be an obstacle. So understand that the idea has to be clear. The problem has to be clear. The conceptualization has to be clear and accepted as a reality. And then the planning system for what is the system to address it? What is the proposal? And 3, how is the infrastructure going to be changed? What are the means? Again, what's the depth? What are the things you're going to do to address it? So after the idea is acceptable, that's A. And then you've got a plan to address it, that's B. And then C, how does the plumbing change? What are the nuts and bolts? How is the wiring of the institution, the infrastructure of the institution, whether it's training or what have you, how are those things changed? Number 4, senior leadership. That's the pervasiveness, getting everybody across the institution on board. 5 is sufficient resources. You can have everybody on board with the greatest idea and ready to roll and ready to act, but if you don't have the resources, which resources are human resources, the people in place to do it, and then fiscal resources, the financial support, then it's going to be an obstacle. So sufficient resources. And then finally, the most important aspect is the activating, what I call the activating mechanism, the switch that turns it on or off, and that's accountability. Right? Accountability and incentives. You got to build in accountability in the system, which includes incentives, rewards, sanctions for folks that don't comply, etc., and so forth. So this is the plan that is put together. So let's look at each one of these one by one in a little bit of detail. And again, You'll have the recordings to go through this, and we'll make sure that the slides are available to all of you so that you can look at this in even greater depth. But I'm going to go through this pretty quickly so that we'll have time to address some of the questions you have. So the first thing is the plan development. And so there are steps and stages that occur there. So, the idea behind addressing systemic racism, again, if you've got senior leadership that doesn't accept that it's a problem, well, you're starting at number one, the idea that systemic racism is not defined at all or not accepted. So you want to bring them to number two, that it begins to emerge, systemic racism begins to emerge in conversation. So you start to have conversations with the senior leadership about the reality of this. And then number three, it begins to be defined in a broad, inclusive terms. So it's demonstrated to senior leadership how structurally, systemically, systemic racism exists in different parts of the institution. That's what inclusive means. And then finally, the goal is that there's an acceptance that systemic racism is broadly defined and is of the highest institutional priorities to address regarding the institution's commitment to excellence. So you take a person from the beginning where there's no idea or there's no conception about the problem to the point where there is not only a broad definition about the problem, but there's a commitment to addressing the problem as part of the institution's or the city's goal of excellence, right? And so that's the first part of a plan when you're dealing with the idea of dealing with systemic racism. The second is dealing with the plan itself. So how do you address it? So first, as an institution, many cities have no diversity plans to deal with systemic racism. So then the first part is a major goal of the institution is to develop a plan. And then after there's a consensus or agreement about developing a plan, then there'll be some initiatives within several layers that exist with several layers of success. There'll be a rudimentary plan and initiatives that start, but then you want full implementation of a comprehensive system and a comprehensive plan across the institution to address the problem of racial disparities and systemic racism as part of the institutional culture. You want it as part of the culture of the institution to address these kinds of problems and head on in a proactive way. And that is the scope of going from the existence of no plan to the existence of a plan that binds the institution, that's a component of the institutional culture, and that is comprehensive in addressing the strategic goals and the direction of the institution as it relates to excellence. If the city's striving for excellence, and there's no city, no institution that doesn't strive for excellence. Believe me, if it's a city, if it's a school, if it's a company, even if it's law enforcement, if it's a non-for-profit, everybody strives for excellence. And you can't achieve excellence if you're leaving folks behind, or if you're parading on the direction of excellence and stepping on folks in the path. So you've got to address how the institution is moving and the direction that it's moving in. And this is what the strategic diversity plan looks at in addressing systemic racism. The infrastructure, what are we going to do to animate change, to navigate, to change the institutional direction? Institutions, are like, icebergs. They're like, large ships. They don't just turn easily. There has to be many people on board to steer an institution to a completely different direction. So the infrastructure has to be there to allow the institution to shift into a different direction in terms of how it does things. So how do you move the institutional infrastructure? Well, first it starts that there are few or no institutional resources in the infrastructure of the institution to address it. That's normal in many institutions. They're starting with zero. They don't know how to go about it. But then an element of an infrastructure begins. So they bring in people that understand strategic diversity leadership. They bring in different stakeholders from the community, maybe marginal, maybe underfunded, maybe no funding. But an infrastructure starts to emerge. They start to make an effort to change the plumbing of the institution proverbially, right? Then several initiatives emerge across the institution to do the same thing. So if the plumbing is changed in one aspect of the institution, the plumbing changes in a different aspect, room to room, so to speak. The room to room, the entire house is redecorated slowly but surely. It's repainted, right? And so it goes from part to part, block to block, area to area. And then finally, you have someone in the institution, a chief diversity officer or some leader who is in charge of addressing systemic racism, a chief diversity officer, or whoever the person is, whose role is to support the president or director or the mayor of an institution or the CEO of the institution with governance in incorporating the plan into the institution with accountability. And so bit by bit, it's built from the ground up, so to speak. Right? Senior leadership. Oftentimes, addressing systemic racism is not on the radar of senior leadership. Right? Not a goal, not a priority, and oftentimes there's a resistance. But in some cases, that's not the case, as we've seen with many companies, and I mean, even with the transformation of the NFL, for example, the acknowledgement by the commissioner, for example, of racial problems, systemic racism. That's a major thing. If you can get senior leadership to acknowledge that a problem exists, that's the goal. But oftentimes addressing systemic racism is not on the radar. But then senior leadership begins to engage. There are no resources, but there's symbolic support. That's when a statement is put out, for example, symbolic support. That's a normal stage within the process, in the continuum. So, but that's not the end. What you want after that is to have senior leaders have a strong grasp of the issues and to bring support for resources across all aspects of the institution. So now that senior leadership has hinted that they are on board or that they are beginning to engage, you want to capitalize on that. You want to galvanize support to cultivate that kind of awareness and that welcoming, and to foster it so that senior leadership begins to understand not only the problem, but how addressing the problem is central to excellence of the institution. And then what will happen is the goal in this is to have senior leadership become a vocal advocate and to prioritize prevention and action in all aspects of the city, of the corporation, as it relates to excellence, as it relates to funding for initiatives that address the problem of systemic racism, establishing strategic partnerships to help counter it, and to build communal relations to help make the city, the organization, the institution excellent, right? So that's what is needed. When senior leadership is on board, everyone else falls in place, right? Resources. Even if senior leadership is on board, you've got to have the right people and some funding that's allocated. Oftentimes, there's not sufficient resources are absolutely non-existent. That's okay. It's part of the continuum. But then limited funding is brought in. It's allocated. Maybe it's taken from one place to another. That's what a lot of cities are doing with law enforcement, for example, taking some money from law enforcement and putting it into communal programs, right? Community programs. So funding is found. There's always creative ways to reallocate funding. But then the next level is that resource allocation is high. You may have good funding, but there's a challenge in terms of how to maximize investments for racial diversity. In other words, what is it? How do you demonstrate that this is working? So you're investing in removing systemic racism. How do you know it's actually working? Oftentimes donors and folks that are involved in the fiscal and budgetary planning of the institution, particularly long-term, want to know that that the money that they're putting in a particular project is working, that they're not putting money down a black hole. And they want to see that there's actual change in the institution and in the community as well. So resources may come and go because the priorities of the institution may be wavering back and forth. And particularly this may be seen as in an economic downturn where funding is robust when the economy is doing well, and then funding sort of depletes in these kinds of programs when the economy takes a downturn. That's part of the stage in the continuum. But what you want to get, what the goal is, where funding for programs in the city, in the institution, to address systemic racism, where the funding is not only there, right, but it's generous and it's stable, meaning it's protected in good times and bad times. And that it's a priority when it comes to development and fundraising, right? That it's a priority. It's put in the forefront of the development office or the fundraising department of the institution. And that means it's constantly on the radar of the institution. And finally, the critical components of changes is accountability. You go from no accountability to a shift in building coalitions. Then accountability comes and goes, sort of ad hoc. And then you've got, at the end of the continuum, leaders create stable accountability systems, and leaders hold other leaders accountable as well. So they just don't hold the subordinates accountable, but leaders, city leaders, are held accountable to the as it relates to what subordinates do and what they don't do as well. So accountability runs up the chain as well. There's information here about setting up diversity committees and task force. Putting a plan together is not something you do with 1 or 2 or 3 people. Oftentimes, there's a framework for setting up a committee. You have to look at defining strategic racism. What's the scope of the committee? What are the responsibilities of the committee? And the membership, how many people should serve on the committee? Typically, you need around 9, 10, 11, 12, no more than 15 people or so on a committee. A good number is between 9 and 13 on a committee to tackle this problem in an institution, to deal with addressing systemic racism, coming up with accountability measures, coming up with a diversity plan, etc. I have more information on the slides here about how to set up a committee. What are the questions that you ask that the committee or task force should be dealing with? What is the committee's work to address systemic racism? Is the focus broad? Is it narrow? How do you deal with hiring and bringing in new people into the institution? What level does the committee operate on? They should operate at a very high level in the city and at the institution. Otherwise, their initiatives may not be taken seriously. At the same time, if you're in an institution like law enforcement, setting up a kind of committee like this to report to the chief of police or to report to the police commissioner is not a good idea. You don't want the leader of the institution to control the committee or to exert unauthorized power or pressure or do undue influence. What you want is an independent committee, oftentimes that can implement a plan or make a suggestion. Even if it works in an institution, then it should report directly to leadership that does not have a direct stake in the committee's recommendations, right? So they should be autonomous in that respect. Understanding that whether or not the committee that's putting together the plan should focus on strategy. So what are the strategies that the institution or that the city is going to employ to deal with systemic racism? Or is the committee focused on developing a plan to implement problems, to implement efforts to monitor challenges and problems in the city or in the community? That's a decision that has to be made as a strategy focused on implementation focused committee is part and parcel of the decision that is made within every single institution. I'm going to fast forward because of time to the end. This is all about the committee work, and you can look through that in your own time, since you all will have access to the slides. And so, finally, what do we want to bring it back home? What are the takeaways? Number one, in the last 30 seconds, there are perfect storm factors that are aligning our country and our cities and our institutions up, setting it up for transformational change. We have to do what we can to take advantage of this moment and to galvanize, use the momentum of this moment to push for our municipalities and our institutions to address the systemic racial problems that we have in our cities and institutions. We talked about the 5 dimensions for strategic diversity leadership to address racial challenges is dealing with the organizational leadership, dealing with structural leadership, dealing with political leadership, dealing with symbolic and meaning-making leadership, and collegial leadership, developing the right partners. We talked about establishing a diversity plan with accountability and briefly how to do that. We talked about setting up a committee a little bit, and the framework about setting up a committee is a strategy focus, implementation focus. You need a diverse team of folks to get this done. And then there are recommendations for successful diversity committees. Successful diversity committees that do this work have a clear mandate, a clear understanding of what they're doing. They understand their limitations, they understand their prerogatives, and they function independently of pressure. And they are made up of an incredible cadre of diverse folks that are interested in getting the diversity plan aligned with the institutional's goals and priorities, and centralizing it so that all aspects of these institutions is changed, and that you get transformational, systemic change to address racial disparities and inequities, and not sort of ad hoc, symbolic window dressing changes. So I'll stop here, and I want to give some time for Q&A. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. The question that has come up most in the Q&A and that I've received in chat is, do you have examples of places that are doing this well or are implementing it in an effective way that you can share?
Best examples in a nutshell that I have are institutions of higher education. So institutions of higher education, universities, do this kind of work oftentimes. For example, in institutions of higher education and universities, if you find someone who has the title Chief Diversity Officer, this is what they do for the institution. The House, as in, Nancy Pelosi has just hired a Chief Diversity Officer for the House of Representatives. So the best example are universities. The House of Representatives has just hired one this year, I believe, a Chief Diversity Officer. Other than that, cities across the United States have been in the habit of hiring citizen review, or developing citizen review boards. Those citizen review boards are different from what we're talking about today. Cities have not moved to this level yet. And so what I'm pushing for is for cities to move to this level, because this model of dealing with strategic diversity leadership, coming up with strategic diversity plans, is how you deal with systemic problems of race, of gender, of the absence of the presence of different groups, and how you deal with transformational change, not sort of ad hoc change. So the best examples are universities that are at the cutting edge of this. Many top tier universities, of course, Harvard is one of them, Columbia, Princeton, many other institutions. Many other universities are still trying to follow suit. Cities have not yet done this. Cities are looking for these kinds of solutions.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Kwame. Within the context, of transformational change in organizations, what are your thoughts about beginning the conversation with the origins of occupation, the Native Americans, and institutional slavery, the 1619 report in America, to ensure that everyone is grounded in the origins of systemic racism and the impact on the U.S. and the world?
Yeah, this is phenomenal. I mean, you're going to use a variety of different resources to address the ignorance gap or the miseducation gaps that folks have in different institutions, right? I mean, everybody's going to come at this challenge with a different level of awareness and understanding and acceptability. This is where you have to know your senior leadership very well. This is why conversations need to happen. And so, understanding these, using these historical resources and being able to package information in the proper levels of sound bites, so that you can give dosages to senior leadership, information in small packages, if you will, to senior leadership, that's powerful enough to get them thinking and rethinking about the old prejudices and old conceptions, to change their minds. Oftentimes, senior leadership is thinking about what's legal, right? So sometimes in these discussions about history, what has to happen is that you need to point out where things were legal in the past but didn't work, right? And how our country is still on a continuum going, to excellence, right? So this is part of the cadre of resources that are great to have. But when you're dealing with these presentations with leadership and stuff, you got to package things simply. So a good snapshot, historical snapshot of different events is very important, absolutely.
Great. And a question from Lucia, 2 questions actually. When you reach the goal and achieve transformation, do you continue with the process to ensure that there are no setbacks? And the second part, can the committee look at different diversity issues also through an intersectionality lens?
Yes, yes. So this model, again, we just talked about race here, but then you build it to different diversity issues with intersectionality. You add in gender disparity. You add in, for example, socioeconomic, so issues of poverty are addressed through this model as well. And this is why excellence is important, because a city or an institute, let's start with a city cannot claim excellence while it still has impoverished folks. A city cannot claim excellence while it still has a certain aspect of its population that earns less income than the other aspect. Women still earn less than men in many professions in many cities across this country, for example. Immigration, right? The list goes on and on and on. So this model works across the spectrum for intersectionality and diversity. We just used it for systemic racism today, but it works across the board.
And a question from Andrew, how do we know when incremental change is appropriate and when it's more appropriate to wipe an institution away and start fresh?
How do we know when incremental change is appropriate?
Mm-hmm. And when it's more appropriate to wipe away and start fresh?
Incremental change is appropriate when you have a clear, concise plan and you know what your goal is, and that incremental change is working towards that goal. Incremental change is not appropriate when you don't have a goal and you don't know where you're going, and it's not strategically focused. So you can say incremental change is great because you're working for a particular goal in 3 years, and next year you're going to be here, the 4th year you're going to be there, you're going to be here, etc. In that case, yes. If in the absence of that, then what you have is just gradualism with no goal, and that is not acceptable.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one last question. So could you address the distinction between diversity, inclusion, and the EEO?
Between diversity, inclusion, EEO?
Yeah.
Equal employment opportunities?
Yeah.
Well, diversity is making sure that strategic diversity is what I like to frame it as. Strategic diversity is making sure that you have the right representation at the table to eliminate the blind spots that prevent an institution from stepping on folks or stepping over folks, right? And that allow an institution to meet excellence, to meet the standards of excellence, right? Inclusion is related to that because with diversity, they might be present, but their voices might not be heard. And so inclusion is about not only having folks at the table, but making sure that they are actively representing and participating and asserting their voices that are there. The equal opportunity, what is the EEO, I think is a step along the way, but is not, it's a tactic. It's a means. It is not a goal. Oftentimes it's treated as a goal that folks want to check boxes in terms of the number of folks employed for HR purposes, but it's a means to a larger goal. It is not the goal. It's a tactic, if that makes sense.